The wind that evening carried a strange kind of silence across the dry plains, the sort that makes a lone rider pause and listen harder than usual. Dust clung to his coat and boots, and his horse moved slow under the fading sun, its steps steady on the worn trail. He had spent long days hauling supplies across the frontier, planning nothing more than a quiet night beside a small fire. But trouble comes when a man least expects it, and that night, trouble found him first. He heard it before he saw anything. A soft rattling sound like loose rope swaying in the wind, mixed with a faint gasp that barely seemed human. He pulled the reins and bent forward, eyes narrowed, scanning the trees that bordered the creek bed below. Coyotes had been howling not long ago, and the odd hush that followed told him they sensed something too. He slid off his horse and stepped carefully across the rocky ground, each footfall measured, each breath held tight. Out here, nobody cried for help unless things were already too late. At first, he thought his eyes were playing tricks on him. The branches were dark, blending into the evening sky, but as he stepped closer, he caught a glimpse of bare feet dangling above the ground. A figure swayed gently beneath the tree, bound with worn rope that looked frayed from struggle. He moved closer, heart picking up speed, and the shape finally came into focus. It was a young Apache girl, her wrists tied behind her back, a strip of cloth around her ankles, her long dark hair tangled against the bark. She wasn't fully unconscious, but barely hanging on, her breath shallow, her head leaning forward like she had fought until she could no longer hold herself up. He froze, knowing how dangerous this could be. The frontier was no land for blind trust, especially between drifting ranch hands in the Apache territory. Folks had died for less than approaching someone they didn't know. Still, leaving her there would mean letting the night take her life. He stayed low, eyes scanning the trees, listening for footsteps, arrows, rifles, anything that might give away who had done this and whether they were still close by. The land was quiet, not peaceful, just waiting. He chose caution over hesitation. He whispered softly as he reached up to loosen the rope from the branch, hoping to show he meant no harm. Her eyes fluttered open just enough to see him. They held fear and confusion, but also something else. Something like disbelief that a lone cowboy would risk himself for someone he didn't know. She tried to speak, but no sound came out, just a slow breath that shook her body. The cowboy steadied her weight as the rope came loose, lowering her gently to the ground rather than letting gravity take her. The earth beneath her felt cold, and she tried to push herself up, but her strength wasn't back yet. He knelt beside her, cutting the restraints around her wrists with a small knife he carried for chores. Rope marks circled her skin, deep and red, showing she had been hanging there long enough for pain to settle deep in her bones. She didn't pull away from him, but she didn't cling to him either. There was a quiet dignity in her silence, as if she refused to show vulnerability even in weakness. He offered her water from his canteen, placing it near her hands rather than forcing it to her lips. She looked at him not with gratitude, but confusion, like she couldn't understand why someone like him had appeared in that moment. Her eyes kept drifting past him, toward the distant ridge where the last light was fading. He said she wasn't just hurt, she was watching for something or someone. He told himself she might simply be afraid her captors would return. But a part of him wondered if she wasn't waiting for enemies at all. Maybe she was waiting for allies. Still, he pushed the thought away. He lifted her carefully and carried her toward the creek's edge where the ground was softer. She weighed less than he expected, her frame small but sturdy, like someone who had walked through harsh land all her life. The cold water glimmered nearby, and he dipped a cloth to clean the dirt from her arms. She winced, though she didn't make a sound. The night grew darker, and the wind picked up, whispering through the branches overhead. His horse shifted uneasily, ears turning toward the hills. The cowboy straightened, hand instinctively moving toward the rifle tied to his saddle. He scanned the brush again, thinking maybe a wounded animal or prowling wolf caught the scent of blood. The land was full of predators, and a helpless girl made easy prey. He stepped back toward her, scanning again as he spoke quietly. Telling her he'd get her to a safe place once she could stand, she finally found her voice. Barely audible, speaking short words in a language he recognized only in fragments. He leaned closer to catch her meaning. She repeated it, her voice trembling, not from fear, but urgency. The message sounded like a warning, something about others nearby. He wanted to ask who and why, but before he could, she grabbed his sleeve. Shaking her head as if begging him not to shout or move too fast, he listened and the land answered. A distant crack of wood, not accidental, not natural. Another sound followed, a soft rhythm of movement in the brush, too coordinated to be animals. The cowboy felt a chill crawl through him, slow and steady. He realized then that the silence he sensed earlier wasn't emptiness, but anticipation. Maybe whoever tied her up wasn't gone at all. His pulse quickened, and he stepped back into a crouch, hand gripping his rifle, eyes narrowing into the darkness. The girl looked up at him, her breath uneven, and shook her head again, as if trying to say he shouldn't fight or shouldn't run, or shouldn't trust what he thought was true. And that's when he saw a faint glimmer reflecting off metal hidden in the tall brush across the creek. Not a lantern, not moonshine on water, but steel waiting for movement. He had walked directly into it, blind and alone, thinking he was saving a stranger in need. But the truth settled over him fast and heavy. Saving her wasn't the end. It was the beginning. And somewhere in the unseen dark, something watched him take the bait. He didn't dare move right away. The wind pushed dry grass in small waves, and in that shifting motion he tried to separate what was alive from what was waiting. The girl was breathing harder, eyes still locked on the ridge, not on him. She wasn't hiding her fear, but she wasn't begging either. It was the look of someone who knew what was coming because she had already survived part of it. He leaned close and whispered that they needed to move to cover, maybe behind the fallen logs near the creek bend. She shook her head slowly, her voice barely a breath. She muttered something in her tongue again, this time longer, and though he didn't understand every word, the message was clear enough. If he moved the wrong way, they'd take him before he even fired a shot. He stayed low and kept his back toward her, scanning the shadows. His horse snorted nervously and shifted back, pulling against the rope tied to a branch. It knew danger better than he did. Animals always did. The cowboy slowly loosened his rifle, resting it across his knee, but not raising it fully. He didn't want to spark something too soon. Sometimes survival meant moving. Sometimes it meant staying still. Whatever was watching wasn't rushing. That unsettled him most. A quick ambush gave a man something to react to. Silence meant planning. He glanced back at the girl again, studying her more closely now. The paint marks near her collarbone looked faint, almost worn by struggle or deliberate removal. Her clothing wasn't ceremonial or decorated like those who traveled with large camps. She seemed like someone who had been running for days, not someone placed here as a trap at her own will. Yet the trap was real. Whoever said it counted on someone like him riding by. Someone who couldn't leave a dying person to the night, but was she a victim or part of the plan without choice? He offered her the canteen again, and she took a small sip this time. She spoke softly, one short phrase at a time, her voice scraping through exhaustion. He recognized a few words pointing east, toward distant hills. Maybe she had come from a camp in that direction. Maybe they had been attacked. Maybe she was meant to lure soldiers or settlers away. There were too many maybes to feel safe. The frontier had a way of turning strangers into threats even when they never wished for war. He reached into his saddlebag and pulled out a light blanket, placing it around her shoulders to keep the night cold from settling deeper in her bones. She pulled it tight, eyes still darting to the ridge. She kept trying to speak, pushing words through tired breaths, but they came out uneven. He wished he knew enough of her tongue to understand everything, not just fragments. He caught one word clearly, though. Not a place, not a warning, but a time. Soon. Shadows shifted again in the brush, low and crawling, not tall like riders. Maybe scouts? Maybe just observers waiting for a signal. He realized then that whatever they planned wasn't meant to happen right away. They were watching how he moved, how he reacted, maybe waiting for reinforcements or waiting to see if more men were with him. He glanced at the trail he came from, now dark and empty. He had ridden alone for nearly a week, keeping distance from towns. No one knew where he was. If he disappeared, Nobody would look until long after the dust settled. He rose slowly and moved toward his horse, speaking softly to calm the animal. The creek gurgled beside them, masking the sound of shifting brush. He led the horse near the fallen logs, pretending he only wanted to move camp, not take shelter. If the watchers wanted to ambush, they'd assume he was settling in, not preparing to slip away, but he knew they'd strike if he rode off too soon. They had chosen this place because the narrow creek path forced riders into a single direction. Any escape would be predictable. He needed a way out that didn't follow open ground. The girl tried standing again, pushing her palms against the dirt, legs trembling under her weight. He helped steady her, but she shook her head forcefully, refusing to be carried or held up like someone defeated. There was pride in her bones even in pain. She managed to take a few steps, though each one looked like a battle she wasn't sure she would win. Her body may have been weak, but her mind was locked onto something ahead. She motioned toward a cluster of boulders near the creek wall, pressing her hand against her chest as if urging him to trust her path instead of his own. He hesitated. He didn't know if she wanted safety or if she wanted to lead him somewhere predictable. But the ridge watchers remained still, waiting. Staying put wasn't safer. Moving carefully was his only choice. He nodded and supported her lightly as they moved toward the rocks. The ground sank lower and the creek narrowed into a hidden split between stone walls. It wasn't visible from above unless someone knew to look. She paused to catch her breath, leaning against the rock, sweat gathering across her brow from effort alone. Her silence wasn't empty. It held stories he hadn't heard yet. He wondered how long she had been running, who hunted her, and what had driven them to string her up like bait. He wondered if she had escaped something terrible or if someone had punished her for betrayal. He didn't know if he had rescued someone innocent or someone dangerous. The frontier rarely offered clear answers. It offered choices that either saved lives or ended them. Just as they reached the narrow cut in the rock, a sudden whistle cut through the air. Not wind, not animal, but a sharp human signal. His horse jolted, ears pinned back. The cowboy dropped into a crouch, pushing the girl down behind a boulder as he reached for his rifle. Something moved at the top of the ridge, fast and deliberate, then vanished. He waited for arrows or bullets or rushing footsteps, but none came. The signal wasn't meant to start the attack. It was meant to reposition. The girl grabbed his arm, breathing hard, eyes wide. She whispered again, this time with desperation instead of warning. Whatever group had followed her wasn't just watching him. They were closing in. He tightened his grip on the rifle, heart pounding, mind racing. He had stumbled into a conflict he knew nothing about. Whoever hunted her wasn't giving up. Whoever watched from the ridge had seen him free her. Now he wasn't just a stranger riding by. He was part of her escape. He looked at her, then back at the dark shapes gathering beyond the creek. He didn't know her story yet. Not why she was alone, not why she was hunted, not why she was used as bait, but he knew one thing: if he rode away now, he wouldn't make it far, and if he stayed, the truth would eventually reveal itself. Whether he liked it or not, the night pressed in tighter, shadows closing from every direction, turning the wilderness into a silent arena where every choice carried. Wait, they had escaped the tree, but they were far from safe. The creek narrowed into a twisting passage lined with thick bush and jagged stone. The cowboy kept one hand near his rifle and the other steadying the girl as they moved along the natural corridor. Each step felt heavy, not because of distance, but because every sound seemed too loud. A single snapped branch echoed like a warning. The girl walked beside him, breath shaky, pushing forward as if she had no intention of stopping until she collapsed. Whatever hunted her was close enough to shape her fear into determination rather than panic. It was the kind of fear born from knowing exactly what would happen if caught. He tried to piece together the scene in his head. A lone Apache girl tied to a tree in a place where riders might pass, but not often. No clear signs of struggle around her, no camp, no tracks of a wagon or fire. The ground had been cleaned of any clues. That meant someone placed her there on purpose and erased their trail. It was not thieves being careless or bounty hunters moving fast. It was something organized. He glanced back at the ridge again. Shadows shifted once more, not advancing but tracking. Whoever they were, they wanted him to keep moving. Maybe they wanted him to lead them to others. Maybe they were testing how far he could go before panic took him. The girl finally stopped and leaned against a large boulder where the creek curved sharply. Her knees buckled and she sank to the ground. He crouched down beside her, torn between staying hidden and pushing farther. She pressed her hand to her chest and closed her eyes, whispering a few words that sounded like names or tribes or warnings. He listened, trying to catch anything he recognized. One word stood out. It wasn't from her language. It was English, spoken faintly. Soldiers. His jaw tightened. The frontier was full of tension. Settlers expanding land. Apache bands defending their home. Patrols sent from nearby forts to track raids, escort supply lines, or hunt those who resisted. The girl might have been caught between two forces. Or she might have been punished by her own people for dealing with outsiders. Both had happened before. He asked her quietly if soldiers had tied her to that tree. She didn't answer. She just stared at the ground with a look that carried too many memories for someone so young. He didn't press further. Some things took time to say, even when shared languages existed. A branch cracked behind them, closer this time. He rose and stepped forward, body tense, rifle half lifted, but still low. He expected an arrow or a rifle barrel to appear, but instead a figure stepped into view from behind the brush. Not tall, not armed. An older man with deep lines across his skin and a thick blanket around his shoulders. He carried no visible weapon, but his posture said he wasn't wandering by accident. The cowboy kept his distance, not trusting the sight of empty hands. The man's eyes flicked from him to the girl, then back again, studying them both without speaking. He took a step forward and lifted his chin slightly, signaling peace or observation. The girl whispered something to him, voice softer now, as if recognizing him. The older man answered with a low murmur that carried a tone of familiarity. Though there was tension in it too, the cowboy didn't lower his guard. People who appeared alone didn't survive long in this land without someone hidden nearby. The older man finally looked directly at him and spoke in slow English, saying she should not have been brought here and he should leave. Before night traps finally closed, the cowboy didn't understand the message fully, but the weight of it was clear. He asked who tied her up and why. The man didn't reply. He only pointed toward the hills as if all answers lived somewhere beneath them. The girl tried to stand and reach toward the man, but the moment she moved, something changed in his face, not sorrow and not anger, but conflict. He stepped back instead of supporting her. Before the cowboy could ask anything else, the man disappeared into the brush as quietly as he appeared. No sound of steps. No signs of direction. It was like he had been there simply to confirm something and leave. The girl's breath trembled again. She pressed her palm to the ground, bracing herself. Whatever she had with that man wasn't comfort or trust. It felt like someone torn between allegiance and warning. The cowboy looked to the ridge again. No movement now. The watchers had paused, maybe adjusting plans. Maybe the presence of the older man shifted what they intended to do next. The night grew colder and the sky turned darker. Stars began to scatter overhead, sharp and bright against the blackness. Coyotes howled again in the far distance, but this time the sound felt overshadowed by something more human. They couldn't stay in the open. He helped the girl to her feet, and together they followed the narrow split in the rock deeper, where the ground opened into a small basin sheltered by tall stone walls. The place felt old, untouched, hidden from passing eyes. It could serve as shelter, but it also could become a trap if cornered. He built a small fire with controlled embers, low enough not to signal anyone watching from afar. Warmth spread slowly, giving the girl a chance to recover. She sat close to the flames, rubbing her wrists where the rope had cut deep. The cowboy sat across from her, rifle resting across his lap. The silence between them held questions neither knew how to ask in the other's language. Still, she tried again, speaking fragments, pointing at the hills, at the creek, then back at herself. Her expression shifted between frustration and urgency, like she wanted him to understand a story that mattered more than both their lives. He wished he had traveled with someone who knew her tongue or lived near her people. Stories were best understood before bullets or arrows forced them into action. He offered her jerky and hard bread. She ate slowly, as if unsure whether she would have another chance. When she finished, she stared into the fire for a long moment, then placed her palm over her heart and spoke one name clearly. Not English. Not a word he knew. Maybe her name? Maybe someone she lost? Maybe someone she feared. Before he could ask gently what it meant, a sharp thud echoed from above. A rock tumbling from the ridge. Not by accident, he stood quickly, putting out the fire with dirt and kicking loose embers aside. The girl pressed herself against the wall, eyes wide, body tense. The cowboy raised his rifle, aiming toward the opening above where moonlight spilled through. Then he heard voices. Low, hushed, organized. Several men, not one. They were moving parallel along the upper ridge, searching for a way down. They weren't rushing blindly. They were sweeping the area with precision. Whoever hunted the girl didn't simply want to take her back. They wanted to make sure she never escaped again. The cowboy lowered the rifle slightly and listened hard, counting steps, waiting for the moment when movement stopped. He knew they could find the basin eventually. He knew they could block exits. He knew that staying still wouldn't protect them much longer. The girl touched his arm, her voice low and trembling, whispering something he didn't understand, but her tone said enough. Whatever was coming wasn't just about her. It involved territory, loyalty, survival, and choices that could shape more than one life. He held his breath, pressing himself against the rock as shadows passed along the ridge. They weren't seen yet, but they were close. Too close. The night continued tightening around them like a rope pulling from all directions. And the cowboy finally understood something crucial, saving her from the tree wasn't what made him part of this. The real trouble began the moment he chose not to walk away. The ridge above them stayed alive with movement. Shadows pacing slowly like wolves circling before a strike. The cowboy held his breath, watching the moonlight stretch across the upper rocks, waiting for silhouettes to reveal themselves. The girl stayed low beside him, pressed to the stone, her breath shallow and uneven. The soft glow of the earlier fire had faded, leaving only cold darkness and the distant sound of water slipping through the narrow creek. He studied the terrain, memorizing every escape route the basin allowed. There weren't many. A narrow channel where they entered, another climbable to the south, and a higher slope that looked nearly vertical. They had shelter but no safety. If the group above cornered them here, they would be trapped like animals with no path to run. He leaned close to the girl and whispered that when he moved, she should follow behind him, staying close to the stone shadows. She nodded weakly, though her legs still trembled from exhaustion. She wrapped the blanket tighter, trying to gather what little strength remained. She had been pushed far beyond her limits, yet she still refused to give up. That alone made him more cautious. People who fought through pain usually carried reasons deeper than survival. Another cluster of voices drifted down from the ridge. This time they spoke louder, not whispers but heated tones, like arguments rising among the group. One voice barked orders. The others quieted. That voice had authority, leadership, someone who wasn't stalking out of instinct, but strategy. The cowboy could almost picture them now. A small war party, maybe seeking revenge, maybe protecting their own land, maybe hunting her because she crossed boundaries she shouldn't have. The older man earlier had known them. He wasn't an enemy or ally. He was a witness caught between sides. Shadows shifted again, and the cowboy ducked lower. This time, a figure came into view at the top of the ridge, standing boldly rather than hiding. The shape remained still for several seconds before kneeling down, running a hand across the ground as if tracing tracks in the dirt. Then he pointed directly toward the basin. They were out of time. The cowboy signaled the girl, helping her rise quietly. He led her toward the steep rock wall. It wasn't a path most would choose, not with someone weak, but it offered a chance to climb out before the others dropped in from above. He tested his grip first, finding cracks in the stone and natural footholds carved by years of rain and wind. It was possible. Difficult but possible, she took a step, hands shaking as she reached for a hold. The climb demanded more strength than they had, but her eyes held a stubborn spark. She wanted to keep moving. He climbed ahead just enough to guide her feet. Whispering steady directions, halfway up, a loose stone fell and cracked loudly against the ground. The noise traveled across the basin like a call. The voices above paused. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was focus. He pushed her upward faster, hands guiding her back. Heart hammering so hard he thought the sound alone might give them away. When they reached the ledge, she collapsed forward, breathing hard. He turned back just as shadows dropped from the ridge. Into the basin below. They had moved just in time. The group below scanned the ground, spreading out with silent formations. They didn't look like raiders or bandits. They moved like trained fighters, coordinated and disciplined. One bent down and touched the dirt where the girl had knelt. Another studied the extinguished fire pit. The leader, tall and steady, lifted his chin and stared toward the ledge where they hid. He didn't see them, but he sensed direction like someone who had tracked prey many times before. The girl clutched the cowboy's sleeve, whispering something urgent. Her voice carried pain and fear, but also warning. He didn't know if she was telling him to run or telling him not to shoot. He forced himself to listen to the land again. No arrows yet. No rifles raised. They weren't attacking blindly. They wanted to catch them alive. Maybe they wanted her back alive. Maybe they wanted him alive, because killing him outright would expose their intentions. The cowboy guided her farther along the ridge. Staying low behind brush, the moonlight caught small beads tied in her hair, pieces worn from long travel. Her presence beside him felt like a weight of responsibility he hadn't asked for, but he couldn't abandon her now. Whatever storm she carried was bigger than both of them. The land stretched ahead into rolling hills scattered with pines and broken cliffs. If they reached the tree line, they could lose the group tracking them. But the girl stumbled, knees buckling again. She tried to stand, but her legs gave out in the dirt. He knelt beside her, placing a steady hand on her shoulder, urging her to breathe slowly. Her body shook with exhaustion. The rope wounds on her wrists still bled faintly. She had run too far already. He looked back toward the basin. The group had begun climbing out, spreading in different directions like a tightening circle. They didn't charge toward him. They moved with calculated patience, tracking footprints, broken grass, disturbed dirt. They tracked like hunters closing in on wounded prey. He lifted her and carried her across his shoulders, moving faster along the ridge. The wind cooled his burning lungs and stung the sweat on his brow. The ground sloped downward into a forest thick enough to hide movement. They slipped between trees, branches brushing their clothes, pine needles crunching beneath boots. Once inside the woods, he set her down near an old fallen trunk covered with moss. She leaned against it, trying to steady herself. The forest swallowed sound better than stone. Here, footsteps could be masked. Trails could be lost, but the hunters followed quietly, closing the distance. The cowboy tightened his grip on the rifle. He didn't want to fight, but the woods left no easy escape. He scanned for a cave, a ravine, a narrow pass. Instead, he found an old abandoned campfire pit, long dead and dusted with leaves. Someone had sheltered here once, maybe years ago. It offered no cover. He crouched beside her and whispered that only one choice remained. They couldn't outrun trained trackers. They couldn't hide forever. But they could lure the hunters away, using the forest paths to break formation. He told her to stay behind the trunk while he circled back wide, drawing attention to himself. She refused. Her hand gripped his coat with surprising force. She shook her head hard, eyes burning with fear that had more meaning than danger. She wasn't afraid for herself. She was afraid of what would happen if they caught him. Her voice cracked as she spoke. Too fast, too strained for him to understand every word, but he caught fragments. Something about betrayal. Something about being taken. Something about punishment. Waiting if she returned. He finally understood a piece of the truth. She wasn't running from outsiders, but she was running from her. Own people, whether she defied a rule, protected someone, or escaped a fate she never wanted, he didn't know. But the weight behind her fear told him it was punishment, not rescue. Driving the shadows behind them, the forest moved again. The shapes grew closer. He could see the leader now, stepping between trees with purpose, scanning every angle. More spread to the sides, closing around them like jaws of a trap. The cowboy stood in front of her, rifle low, body tense, breath steady. He didn't aim yet. Drawing first blood could start a war he didn't understand. The leader stepped into the moonlit clearing, stopping several yards away. He stared at the cowboy, then at the girl behind him. His face held no rage, only cold determination. He spoke, his voice low and controlled, saying he wanted her back and the cowboy should step aside before things turned worse. The cowboy didn't move. The forest wind faded, and the night air thickened with silence. More figures emerged, forming a circle. The girl rose behind him, clutching his coat. Whispering his name, though he had never given it to her, he held his ground. Knowing words could still break or build what came next, the leader lifted his hand and the circle tightened. Ready to strike, the circle closed in, each step from the hunters slow and deliberate. The cowboy steadied his breath and lowered his stance, not to attack but to protect. The girl clung to the side of his coat, trembling but refusing to hide behind him fully this time. She stood next to him with what little strength she had left. Her eyes locked on the leader, not with fear now, but with something closer to defiance. The leader raised his hand again, and for a moment the woods fell completely silent. No wind, no insects, no shifting leaves. The cowboy waited for the first strike, expecting arrows or blades or fists, but instead the leader stepped forward alone, leaving his men still in formation behind him. The move felt more like negotiation than attack. The cowboy kept his rifle lowered, showing he wouldn't fire unless forced. When the leader spoke, his voice carried less threat and more burden. He spoke directly to the girl first, using her name, the same one she whispered by the fire. Hearing it from someone else gave it weight. The cowboy finally understood that she belonged to these people in a much deeper way than he realized. She wasn't simply part of a wandering group or a village survivor. She was tied to responsibility. The leader explained slowly in broken English that she had escaped from a duty placed on her, a duty she did not choose. The punishment had never been meant as death, but as a warning to bring her back when she ran. She had left to protect someone, but no one had listened. The cowboy watched her face tighten, eyes wet, hands curling into fists. She answered back in her own tongue, her voice steadier than her body. Though he didn't understand her words, the emotion carried through clearly. She wasn't running from guilt. She was running from being forced into a life that wasn't hers. The leader listened without interrupting. His expression shifted, not to anger but to realization, as if this was the first time he heard her instead of assuming she refused out of pride. A few men in the circle lowered their gazes, tension slipping out of their shoulders. The forest began to breathe again. The cowboy stepped forward carefully, meeting the leader's stare. He didn't raise his rifle or speak with force. He simply told him that tying her to a tree like prey had nearly drawn the attention of other riders, who wouldn't have shown restraint. It could have sparked trouble they didn't want. The leader nodded once, acknowledging that the act had been a mistake born from frustration rather than wisdom. The circle loosened. Torches lowered. Blades shifted back into sheaths. The night no longer felt like a trap, but a tense gathering ready to break apart. The girl stepped away from the cowboy, standing on her own, even though her legs shook. She approached the leader slowly, speaking softer now. Whatever she said made him bow his head slightly. He turned to his men and signaled them to stand down. They backed away into the trees, one by one, leaving only the leader behind. He looked to the cowboy and said that if she wished to leave and choose her own path, they would not chase her again. But she could return if she ever sought them. The words were final and heavy, carrying the weight of a decision that changed more than just one life. With that, he faded into the forest, following the rest of his group, until their shadows melted into the darkness like they had never been there. The girl stood frozen, staring into the trees long after they vanished. The cowboy waited quietly, not asking where she wanted to go or what she planned to do. He knew she needed a moment to let the truth settle. The wind returned, rustling leaves softly, and distant owls called across the night. The world no longer felt pressed against them. When she finally turned to him, her eyes were soft but tired. She placed her hand over her heart again, speaking a small thank you in English this time. The word came out uneven, but filled with meaning. He nodded, telling her she didn't owe him anything. He had done what any decent person should, even if it put him in danger. Sometimes a man doesn't choose trouble, but he stands firm once it finds him. They walked out of the forest together at a slow pace, not running anymore. Dawn crept over the land in pale streaks, warming the cold ground. The world felt different in daylight, safer. The uncertainty still lingered. But now, without fear tying their steps, as they reached open plains again, his horse grazed quietly near the creek where they first stopped. The animal lifted its head when they approached, ears twitching as if sensing the calmer air. The cowboy helped the girl onto the saddle, making sure she was steady before climbing up behind her to guide the reins. They didn't know where the trail would lead, but there was no urgency now. Roads could be chosen with free minds instead of fleeing feet. Hours later, they reached a small abandoned ranch house near a fenced pasture. The place looked worn, but still strong enough to shelter them until she regained full strength. The cowboy built a fire, not small and hidden this time, but warm and steady. He cooked simple food while the girl rested on soft blankets. She watched him quietly, not with fear or confusion anymore, but curiosity. He finally asked her what she wanted to do now that she had her freedom. She thought for a long time, staring at the smoke curling into the sky. Then she told him she didn't want to go back to the life she left behind, and she didn't want to wander lost. She wanted a place where she could begin again without being bound to something she did not choose. He nodded. Understanding more through what she didn't say than what she did, they stayed at the ranch for several days, fixing the roof, gathering supplies, and tending to the land. Each morning she grew stronger. Each night, the conversations between them grew easier, even across language differences. The plains felt less lonely with another heartbeat nearby. The cowboy realized he had been moving from place to place for years without roots, and now, for the first time, staying didn't feel like being trapped. It felt like purpose. Before long, she was walking with steady steps, helping repair the fences, bringing water from the creek, and learning small phrases in English. In return, she taught him words from her own tongue, laughing softly when he pronounced them wrong. The ranch no longer felt abandoned. It carried the sound of life again. One evening, as the sun dipped red behind distant hills, she stood beside him on the porch, watching horses graze in the field. She laid her hand over his lightly, neither pulling away. The moment didn't need words. It belonged to understanding, earned through nights of fear, choices made under pressure, and kindness given without expecting anything in return. The cowboy looked out across the land and breathed the kind of quiet a man can only earn after coming through danger with his soul intact. He knew stories like theirs didn't start with romance or promises. They started with survival, trust, and two people learning to walk the same path by choice. The girl turned to him with a calm smile, no longer haunted, but hopeful. Whatever future waited, it would be shaped by their own hands, not forced by others. Together they watched the sky fade into night, the land peaceful again, and the wind gentle instead of warning. The frontier still carried storms, but this time they faced it not as strangers and not as hunted and rescuer, but as partners building a quiet life on open soil. And as the stars rose above them, the world finally felt safe enough to rest.